So my talk is going to be a little different. We've heard a lot about HCR, we've heard a lot about metrics, etc. And those are some important aspects, very important aspects of iBanking. There are, in fact, three key areas of measuring criteria for iBanking success. The first area is scalability. And it's a commitment to growth. It's the infrastructure and the systems. It's professional staff, and it's metric-driven culture. And as I said, we've heard about that just in the last couple of sessions. The other next is around sustainability. Sustainability is about essentially your ability to cover your costs. You're having financial reserves and having a strong governing leadership. And the third area, which we heard about from Usha Gopinathan, is around quality. It's around meeting all medical standards, passing iBank accreditation, and having constant development for your staff. So what we're going to focus on in this session, in this talk, is around sustainability, financial sustainability particularly. So let's start with really taking a look at what is the true cost of providing transplantable corneas. And if you look at this at a very high estimated level, in the United States, for example, the cost is roughly around $3,000 US for an optical grade tissue. If you look at other regions, if you look in South America, typically it's anywhere from $800 to $1,000, around $950. We've had a little experience in Africa, and it's actually quite expensive. There's a lot of inefficiencies in that country, in that continent, and so it's actually the cost has so far been running around $500 US. And you look at India. India, certainly relative to those other regions, is an incredibly low cost at around $180. Now you translate that to Indian rupees for many of you here in the audience, and that's, of course, around 9,000 rupees. Now, I will say I've got a stamp on each one of these slides that says, estimate only, costs vary by iBank. So each iBank has a unique set of costs. So anybody who asks me, well, what does it cost to process a cornea? There is no one single answer. It really depends. It depends on, and I'll talk about some of those, it depends. So as we're talking about total cost, let's change our terminology a little bit, and let's talk about it going forward as processing cost. That as Brenda said, you have common terminology amongst iBanking, and that's the terminology that's used is a processing cost. So let's break that processing cost down. Now, I have spent a number of years here in India, and I've traveled the world, and I find there tends to be an impression that when it comes to iBanking, the cost really is in the supplies and the testing, the serology testing. And as you can see, for a typical iBank, that really only represents less than 20% of the overall cost. You've got rent and lease around 12%. You've got transportation, and transportation is both for bringing the tissue into the iBank as well as transporting it out. But by far the biggest cost is staff. Essentially 50% of a typical iBank's cost is in the staff. So what does the staff do? So I think we've heard a lot from Dr. Basak and Brenda in particular about all the activities. And this is just a short list of the many activities that they do. So you have to pay that staff for all those activities. And when I listen to Usha's talk about quality and accreditation and all the tremendous amount of steps that have to be gone through for that, quality alone can use up a lot of your staff's time. So let's talk about what drives those costs. I mean, those are the cost categories, but what allows you to bring your costs more in control? So this is looking across on a lot of this specifics. I'm looking more at India. As Dr. Basak pointed out, we have 11 partners here in India, and it's given us an opportunity to really understand much more the cost dynamics. And if you look at establishing a professional eye bank, which, as Dr. Basak outlined, that means that you have a manager, a professional manager, you have eye donation counselors, you have technicians. You really have to build your infrastructure up. And so, as you can see here, if you're only doing 100 transplants a year, and you have that professional staff, your costs are going to skyrocket. They're going to be somewhere in the 15,000 rupee level per transplantable cornea. The efficiency with volume rapidly comes down. You have your fixed cost of your manager. You have your fixed cost of the rent of the lab. All those costs start coming down rapidly as you expand. So in India, all things equal, by the time you get out to roughly 1,000 corneas, you should, if you're a well-performing eye bank, be in the $7,000 to $8,000 range, 7,000 to 8,000 rupee range. So let's talk about another key cost driver. Counselors. Dr. Basak talked about the whole counselor structure and how important it was to train and develop them. Well, here's the cost of how important it is to develop your eye bank, eye donation counselor well. So if you look at this is essentially looking at the counselor cost per transplanted tissue. If that counselor goes off and essentially transplants it brings you one transplantable tissue a month, your cost for that counselor is going to be about 12,500 rupees. And this is based upon looking at the cost of a counselor, taking their salary, plus any bonuses, plus any benefits and training cost of around 15,000 rupees a month. So very quickly your costs drop. So by the time you're out to 8 or 9 consenting transplanted tissues per counselor, you're down to a tenth of that cost. The advantages in a manager in investing in training is huge. The payoff is tremendous. Cost driver number 3, tissue utilization. Dr. Basak outlined that if you look at HCRP, there are rates now of utilization of around 72%, as the graph on the right shows. Overall, the utilization rate is around 38 to 40%. And if you look at voluntary, it's only running at 32%. Now, voluntary is still the primary way that corneas are collected in India. So if you look at the cost of having a low utilization rate, since about 60% of your costs are direct costs that are driven up by having to go out and recover tissue that ultimately isn't used, or serology tests, or gaining the consents. If you have a low consent rate, your costs for your eye bank are much, much higher. So if you look at this graph on the left, you see if you're at the 30% consent rate, your costs are double that if you're at 80% consent rate. So there's a lot of key ways to bringing your costs under control. But where does the funding come from ultimately? If you look at the United States and a number of other countries have a very straightforward approach, and that is that you take your processing cost and you reflect that cost to the surgeons, ultimately to the insurance companies, to the patients, in the form of a processing fee. It allows your eye bank to operate. Now, I think as most of us know, a processing fee is not selling the tissue. It is simply covering the cost of what it takes to allow your eye bank to operate. Brazil takes a somewhat different approach. They recognize all the activities that we spoke about, and they essentially compensate the eye banks for all those activities. So they fully cover the costs. In India, it's a mix. The Indian government provides 1,500 rupees per pair of recovered collected eyes, which, depending on the performance of your eye bank, comes out to be about 20% of the funding for your corneas. So the eye banks are essentially forced to come up with some combination of processing fees, getting essentially support from the governing eye institute. And so what I mean by that is if you're an eye bank that's part of a larger institute, the institute provides you with free serology testing, they provide you with free rent. There's a lot of soft costs that sometimes aren't visible because that larger institution is essentially subsidizing the eye bank. And lastly, there's establishing a corpus, going out and soliciting donations. So it's a little less straightforward here in India and actually many other developing countries where the clear understanding of what the total cost of eye banking is not really well understood. So the eye banks have to come up with a variety of ways of covering that cost. So what are the recommendations? So at the eye bank level, the recommendation is that all eye banks create an independent structure, at least in terms of financials, and ideally in terms of governance. That allows you to truly isolate and understand what your costs are and be able to address it. And that means recognizing not only the hard costs, but the soft costs. So the costs of those so-called free benefits that are being provided, say, by the parent organization. Ultimately, that parent organization may understand that those are true costs for the larger organization, and they may no longer want to cover them. So it's good to at least recognize them and officially call them out. Number 3 is develop a clear growth plan and expense plan, and focusing on the 3 productivity drivers. And then lastly, develop a sustainable funding plan. How are you going to pay for that 3 to 5 year growth plan? And that can be any combination of government funding, processing fees for paying patients, and donations. At the country level, what needs to happen is essentially countries, governments need to recognize that these costs are real. And in order for eye banks to scale up, these costs have to be covered. What also needs to be recognized is in the funding that comes, whether it's from the governments or other organizations, the funding needs to focus on outcomes, transplanted tissues, not on activities, collected tissues, in order to encourage efficiency. Thank you.